Our second keynote speaker today comes to us from Charlotte's Leading on Opportunity, where he is the senior manager overseeing data and evaluation. AJ Calhoun holds master's degrees in public policy and theological studies, which will give you a sense and some indication of where his heart and passions lie. AJ brings a systemic approach to addressing the key determinants of early care and education, college and career readiness, and child and family stability, while simultaneously focusing on the cross-cutting factors of segregation and social capital. While relatively new to his position here in Charlotte, he is a native Charlottean and has spent the last 5 years applying rigorous human-centered policy design and evaluation methodologies to the challenges of economic mobility. His work has taken him to 30+ countries and includes time with the World Bank's consultative group to assist the poor, and as a research fellow at the United Way of Central Carolinas, where he focused on creating healthy, affordable communities. It seems fitting that one of AJ's side accomplishments is certification as a rescue diver, because today he will help us dive into the data as he shares with us what he sees as the traits of Charlotte's thriving neighborhoods and what those insights mean for uplifting the rest of Charlotte. AJ?
Michael, thanks so much for that introduction. It's going to be hard to follow Dr. Telfair and the wisdom that he left us with, but though we did not collaborate on our presentations, it does seem like that there's a thread that runs between both of them. We talk a lot in our work about decorrelation and weakening correlations, and we'll talk more about that as we kind of get into this presentation, but this idea that, right now we can see in the data relationships between where you live and the color of your skin and how much money your parents made and your outcomes. And our goal, as Dr. Telfair said, work ourselves out of a job. We want to see those things no longer be correlated with some of these economic mobility outcomes. So my hope today, and I'm going to share my screen now, if you give me just a moment. There we go. So my hope today is to walk through first kind of what is the data that we have on economic mobility by neighborhood, and then discuss which factors best explain the geographic variation that we observe. And then we can take those factors and use them as a framework to identify where action is most needed. So let's dive in. The folks on my team know that one of the fastest ways to get me up on a soapbox is to use a community level indicator. So metropolitan and county and even city level descriptive statistics can be really powerful, but they can also be really deceiving. So now I know that sometimes these data are the best data that we have. And in that case, let's make the most of the data that we have. But I certainly won't be the first or last person to say that if we're really going to move from data to action, we need to help folks with power over resources understand that disaggregation is worth the price tag. And of course, we need to disaggregate in a number of ways, but particularly when we talk about economic mobility, I want to argue in favor of breaking down what we know about our city by neighborhood. So take, for example, the statistic that you see here. About 1 in every 2 third graders in CMS is proficient in English and math by the time they take their end of grade testing. And since we know that third grade test scores are a strong predictor of future economic mobility, we might be tempted to design some sort of large scale education intervention to close that gap. We put snappy taglines on everything in Charlotte, so I imagine it might be called something like the student sitting next to you. But it turns out that while 1 in 2 may be true in a technical sense, it won't be surprising to any of y'all that it's not true in a practical sense. So when we look at third grade proficiency at a neighborhood level, we see that outcomes follow a pretty familiar geographic pattern. Nearly every student in the wedge scores proficient on their EOG, while about 1 in 10 from the crescent achieve that same score. So when we look at this 50% number, we're really just averaging the experiences and outcomes of 2 very different communities. And you might be asking if this pattern holds true for other social determinants, or more likely you probably already know that it does. So is this just a rich schools versus poor schools thing, or are neighborhoods actually significant drivers of variation in economic mobility outcomes? The folks up at Opportunity Insights have tracked how much of the variation in economic mobility overall is explained by conditions at different geographic levels. And as you can see here, the census tract and the high school catchment area explains more than half of this variation. And for Black folks, high school and neighborhoods explain almost 2/3 of the variation. As we expected from the 3rd grade reading example, county level really isn't very explanatory at all. What this tells us is that if we're going to take action on economic mobility, our work needs to be place-based. But how specific do we need to focus? Well, we can get a clue by comparing data on the impact of poverty rates on child household income by distance at the block and tract level. So from the chart on the left, we see conditions in the half-mile radius around a child's home are pretty strong predictors of their economic mobility. And from the chart on the right, that although census tracts are slightly larger, maybe around a mile from the center point, that they're still pretty good proxies for neighborhoods. So what this tells us is that if we want to understand what to do about economic mobility, we need to understand it at a neighborhood level. And that's exactly what the Opportunity Atlas sets out to do, map mobility. So Charlotte may be 50 out of 50, but some of its neighborhoods are opportunity engines and others are opportunity deserts. So on the other hand, Salt Lake City, which is #1 in mobility, if you look at this map, there's only a few blocks that are blue, but Salt Lake City will light up almost entirely blue. What we need to ask next is, why does this variation exist? Is there something fundamentally different about the people in different colored tracks? We can say, is this a matter of selection, or are these outcomes the product of neighborhood conditions? Or we could say the causal effects of place. To answer this question, we need to go back 30 years to a HUD experiment that was hailed at the time as, well, a failure. The experiment was run with 4,600 families across 5 cities in the mid-90s. And this experiment set out to discover, what would happen if families living in high poverty areas moved to low poverty areas. So postmortems that were done in the late 90s and the early 2000s found that this moving to opportunity experiment didn't really improve outcomes for participants in terms of economic mobility. There were a couple of improvements, but in terms of economic mobility, it was inconclusive at best. But Chetty and his colleagues showed in a 2016 paper that while outcomes for parents and older children didn't change very much, that if we wait and we look in the data longitudinally, that economic mobility increased for children in the experimental group who moved before they turned 13. So what this tells us is that given otherwise pretty similar family environments, place-based effects had a very strong influence on outcomes. So I want to show you outcomes for one of the sets of sites. So participants in the Chicago study were residents of 3 public housing developments on Chicago's south side. These families were randomly assigned into one of 3 groups. Folks who got housing vouchers only valid in low poverty census tracts. These will be represented by the diamonds on the map. Folks who got housing vouchers without restrictions, those will be the triangles. And folks who didn't get housing vouchers, they'll stay where the circle dots are now. So we can see here that where the folks who got those vouchers moved. So I used to live right between where it says Washington Park and Grand Crossing, but even if you don't know anything about Chicago's neighborhoods, it's clear from where these dots are that the distribution of destinations has a pattern to it. So when we compare average outcomes for children in each of these families with average outcomes for families in each neighborhood in the Opportunity Atlas, that map that I showed you earlier, we see this pattern even more clearly. When kids move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, they're more economically mobile themselves. This trend wasn't just a quirk of the experiment in Chicago. When the analysis was repeated in other cities, you'll see there at the bottom, it persisted in each of the other moving to opportunity sites. So from these data, we can see that variation in economic mobility seems to be driven not by selection, but by the causal effects of place. As soon as we accept that causal effects of place drive variation more than selection, what we want to know is, what are the traits of thriving neighborhoods? What are the most important factors that make some of the neighborhoods on this map of Charlotte light up blue while others light up red? Chetty identifies 4 traits: lower poverty rates, stable families, by which he means 2-parent families, greater rates of social capital, and better quality schools. In the task force report, which you haven't read, is available on our website, leadingonopportunity.org. We contextualized these factors into 5 determinant areas that are most relevant for our region. So segregation, child and family stability, early care and education, college and career readiness, and social capital. Michael alluded to these at the beginning, but these predictors are still very broad. So what specifically could we measure in every neighborhood around Charlotte that would clue us in to how economic mobility is changing as our community works to tackle this issue? So we can look more closely at what factors are most indicative of mobility to help answer this question. We can use these correlations to challenge what we think to be true about economic mobility, and then to target our actions accordingly. So for instance, in box A, we see that proximity to jobs, so local job growth, doesn't seem to matter nearly as much as proximity to people who have jobs, so employment rates or unemployment rates. Similarly, while 3rd grade test proficiency is still predictive, as we talked about at the beginning, if we think back to that slide where we examined the share of variation by school catchment zone, we can imagine that attending a higher quality school may actually matter more in the long run than how well a child performs on one particular test. If we look deeper at this evidence from Chetty and from others, we can compile a list of neighborhood characteristics that explain half or more of the variation from one neighborhood to the next. So you can see these 9 here. Its share of single parent households, its share of college graduates, are you zoned for quality neighborhood school, segregation by income and by race, employment rates, share of residents that fall below the poverty line, income inequality, transit access, and social capital. By focusing our measurement on these things and comparing these indicators with the Opportunity Atlas as something like our counterfactual, we can create something of an opportunity index that tracks our progress and points toward the kind of interventions that might be most likely to move the needle. So we're just beginning to dive into what this might look like. But in keeping with the theme of today, knowing what makes a thriving neighborhood isn't enough. We need to move from that data to action. So we can do maybe 3 things, or maybe 3 buckets of things. We can enable people to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. We can invest in neighborhoods to increase opportunity outcomes. And we can reduce the kind of stickiness in intergenerational mobility by expanding access to post-secondary pathways. So I'll close by walking through each of these in turn. First, like the Moving to Opportunity experiment, we can create more moves to opportunity. So Chetty and his team piloted a follow-on experiment to the Chicago example we discussed earlier in partnership with the city of Seattle just a few years ago. The results of that study are pretty promising, and what they indicate is that moving families with younger children, as we expected from the Moving to Opportunity experiment, and helping families use their vouchers in higher opportunity neighborhoods leads to better outcomes. So in Charlotte, Leading on Opportunity is supporting our local housing authority in Livian to apply to participate in a larger scale trial modeled after this experiment in Seattle that hopefully will be rolled out by HUD in the coming years. And overall, the work that we saw in Chicago and that I'm describing here in Seattle shows us that our focus on affordable housing and housing access needs to be targeted to high opportunity neighborhoods particularly. So in the last Q&A, folks were asking about policy kind of interventions. From a policy perspective, there's been a lot of talk about the 2040 comprehensive plan recently, and this plan really does offer aspirational tools that look to expand access to lower cost housing in higher opportunity neighborhoods. So if you're not yet, get involved with the 2040 approval process, and if the vision of the plan gets passed, stay engaged through the development ordinance development process as well, where this work will really be localized and places will be made in collaboration with communities over the course of the next few years. If we want the biggest kind of bang for our buck on this moving to opportunity, we can look at what Chetty calls opportunity bargains. So these are relatively low cost neighborhoods. Nothing in Charlotte is really low cost anymore, but they're relatively low cost with higher opportunity outcomes. So what I've done on this map is overlaid average rent and average home prices on top of the Opportunity Atlas data to identify some of these potential opportunity bargains in Charlotte. There's still more research that needs to be done on this locally, but from this map, we can see that areas like East Forest, Starmount, Wedgwood, Bradfield Farms, along with some parts of Pineville, Matthews, and yes, Ballantyne even as well, may be some of these opportunity bargains in Charlotte. As we look to build affordable units and increase density in areas across our city, these kind of pink dots are areas that are worth doing some more digging into. But it's not all about moving folks between neighborhoods. We want to focus also on improving conditions within neighborhoods. And this brings us to the kind of second bucket and returns us to this kind of grid of 9 kind of indicators. We can invest in these neighborhoods to improve opportunity outcomes. And so the task force report, again, if you haven't read it, you should take a look at it, outlines a host of strategies, pardon me, for doing this. But if we look at these 9 areas, we can see each of them indicates an action that could be targeted toward increasing mobility in a more particular way. So for family structure, we can think about reducing the number of single-parent families and unplanned pregnancies. For educational attainment, we can think about increasing post-secondary attainment, not just degrees, but also credentials that lead to high-paying jobs. We can think about educational access and using that to point us towards focusing on improving school quality in lower opportunity neighborhoods. For family stability, we can think about more jobs with living wages. For economic access, ensuring access to transit options. For economic attainment, increasing the number of employed individuals as opposed to just the availability of jobs in neighborhoods. For segregation, we can think about reducing the number of racially and economically segregated neighborhoods, which if we look at racial dot maps for Charlotte, we can see that there are still a high number of neighborhoods that are racially segregated, but also economic segregation is an important component of this as well. It's not just about living with folks who look different, but living with folks that earn different as well. So next, inequality. Closing the wealth gap. There have been some work that's come out of UNCC recently about the wealth gap in Charlotte and reducing economic disparities. And finally, social capital. We can increase access to programs that provide mentoring and life navigation. I think the community health worker model can be brought into a lot of other contexts to bring this kind of navigation component into education space, into other spaces as well. We'll talk about that in a bit. And we can encourage participation in what some have called SEAM institutions, things like houses of worship, YMCAs, places where folks can meet people who are different from them in kind of experience and background and can create relationships across those boundaries and share social capital. If you're interested in diving deeper on strategies to increase opportunity in neighborhoods, again, I'll make a final plug for our website, leadingonopportunity.org, where we have a number of these strategies laid out, and also for Results for America, which has a library of economic mobility interventions in their catalog. You can see that at catalog.resultsforamerica.org. Ultimately, this work is pretty difficult because measurement is difficult in some of these areas, but every day we're increasing our capacity to rigorously ask what works. And to that end, one of the most important things we can do is to build capacity for small and grassroots organizations to collect and analyze data so that those experiences and innovations are not left out of the picture of information that we have to try to point us towards what might be the next type of intervention that would be worth trying. So this type of evaluation capacity building will help us not only validate existing interventions, but also target funding and innovate in new ways. Before we move on to the last set of interventions, I want to talk for a moment about displacement. I once heard a lecture where someone challenged Chetty's findings, saying, in essence, moving to opportunity won't work because it's not scalable. To an extent, the person who asked this question was right. We can't just move everyone from the crescent to the wedge, and no one is proposing that should be our strategy. However, as our city grows rapidly, the issue we need to grapple with is not how to move everyone from the crescent to the wedge, but what happens when the wedge starts moving to the crescent. And particularly as we make large-scale investments that ostensibly increase economic mobility all around the city, like transit investments. If you look at parcel data for properties surrounding the proposed Silver Line stops, which I've put the map here, you can't see the names of the parcel owners, but you can go online and this is open access data. You'll see that the properties surrounding these proposed Silver Line stops on the West End are owned by developers and out-of-state holding companies, And this light rail is still years from being realized, and already many of these homes around closer in stops are owned by investors. So while we're focused on moving to opportunity and increasing opportunity in neighborhoods, we need to focus also on fighting displacement to give folks who currently live in these neighborhoods access to the investments we're making in them. One of the many ways we can do this is by leveraging capital to ensure the benefits of public investments like transit investments are shared by all. And it's not just about transit investments. Programs like federal opportunity zones and local opportunity corridors can be leveraged in this way also. So finally, we can interrupt intergenerational mobility through post-secondary education. The social determinants perspective can be incredibly useful in this work. For instance, this view can be brought into the education sphere by helping education partners think more holistically about services that students might need to be successful. So one model from an organization called 1 Million Degrees uses this kind of adapted social determinants framework, which I've put on this slide, to increase community college persistence. And early results from a randomized control trial of 1 Million Degrees program participants shows that this methodology, this social determinants for education model, increased persistence rates in community colleges by nearly 50%, which is fantastic results. So we've got statewide efforts like My Future NC, which has a goal of increasing the number of post-secondary degrees and credentials to 2 million by 2030. These things are ramping up to focus our community and communities around the state on post-secondary attainment, not only in terms of 4-year degrees and 2-year degrees, but also in terms of working credentials. We have opportunities as these things grow to expand the type of work that organizations like 1 Million Degrees are doing here in Charlotte. So in summary, there are 3 kind of big buckets of types of strategies. We can create moves to opportunity, we can improve opportunity outcomes in neighborhoods, and we can reduce stickiness by expanding post-secondary pathways. When we sum it up in 20 minutes, it seems pretty straightforward, but as many of y'all know from doing this work for a long time, it's a bit harder to do than it is to talk about. And oftentimes, working through the data and actions needed to solve Charlotte's economic mobility crisis can feel really overwhelming. I'm sure many of you have been discouraged in our work by the kind of magnitude of this issue. I certainly know that I have. And it's not just big, it's longitudinal too. So even the best interventions won't really bear fruit for years. We've got to unpack centuries of racism and disentangle rooms full of binders, full of inequitable policies. But what y'all are doing today is melting the ice that's frozen these institutions. And for that, I want to say thank you. Thanks for being here today, for being engaged in this community in Charlotte, for caring about this work. As a community, Charlotte's got a long way to go if we're going to improve outcomes for the most vulnerable citizens in our community. And in some cases, we're going to work very hard for a very long time. Dr. Telfair alluded to quotes from decades ago. We're gonna work very long for a very hard time before we see changes on these things. But if we're patient, it will come. Every paper, every pilot, every gathering like the one that we're having today brings us just that much closer. We're not there yet, and no city is. If we look to Chetty and others that are leading the national dialogue on economic mobility, they'll tell you the same thing. But if you listen, they'll also say, look at the folks in Charlotte. They saw the data. They were honest with one another about what needs to change. We can do more honesty, I think. And then they took action on those things. We're going to be at this work for a long time, and we're going to learn a lot more as we go, but we're not going to stop pushing forward. Looking at the conversations that you guys are slated to have later today, I know you won't either. And so thanks for sticking with us. Thank you so much also for having me here today. I'm really, really honored. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, AJ. Very inspiring and very data-driven, what we're going for. I ask you if you have questions for AJ to put them into the chat. We have our first one about this issue about out-of-town investment speculating on future development and displacement. Can you talk about strategies related to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really hard question and something that we think about a lot in our work. We would like to imagine that there's some sort of big red button we can press in terms of a policy intervention that could, prevent these types of things from happening. But what I think unfortunately, we can't do that. So what we need to do is we need to get smarter about the way we as a community invest to try to leverage the fact that this is happening. So there's a great example from an organization in Portland called a community investment trust. And what this does is when out-of-town speculators come into a neighborhood that is at high risk of displacement, what they do is they will buy they'll use impact investing dollars to buy a large, maybe it's a strip mall in that community. And then over time, they sell small dollar shares of that to people who live in that community already. So what that does is when out-of-town investors come in, they kind of get the excitement going and property there becomes more valuable. So by allowing community members to buy into the property that's there, they kind of can be lifted up as that goes. There are other strategies like this that other cities are using. That's just one example, but we can't stop it from happening, but what we can do is get smarter about how we leverage that to try to make impact with our kind of social impact focus.
A follow-on I'll add to that is particularly with how Charlotte and its tight housing market and how that's changing dynamics as well. Concerns about the way developer tends to be very homogeneous in terms of the economic pricing point. You don't see developers developing across the whole continuum. You have these clusters of single sort of economic brackets, and so that perpetuates some of these little bubbles that you've talked about. What strategies do you have there?
Yeah, I think this is hard work, and a lot of cities are trying to figure this out. If you voted for our housing bond referendum in this past fall, you participated in helping solve this. We can raise more public dollars to provide gap funding. There are developers out there that want to build at the below the 80% AMI range, area median income range. But the problem is that a lot of those developers are trying to justify kind of their financial position as well. And as much as I wish everyone was in the social sector or the public sector and was motivated primarily by how much good can we do, we can kind of have public-private collaborations where we can either through, we have something in Charlotte called the Housing Trust Fund, which is funded from the philanthropic side, and then also from the public side, we can use those dollars to kind of close those gaps. So we can expand the dollars in those pools. We can also do kind of more creative tactics that will allow us to increase density at a lower price point. So one of the innovations that I think has been working for a number of cities that are kind of further ahead of us on the like skyrocketing prices are things like accessory dwelling units, which basically allow someone who has a single family home to build a small single family home. Sometimes it's like a tiny house, or sometimes it's like a room above the garage, and can rent that out at much lower price points. And especially in neighborhoods where you've got folks who are in kind of vulnerable economic positions, but who are also homeowners, this can be a really good strategy for building wealth as well, and trying to kind of fight some of those forces of displacement as taxes rise, as the kind of value of people's homes rise as well. So again, hard work, but there's some strategies here.
Please submit other questions. I see there's a comment about, I guess, the barriers to women in particular sort of benefiting economically through policies such as access to reversible contraception and other things. So if you want to broaden that a little bit to other barriers specifically to women.
Yeah, I can say that this is an area that we as Leading on Opportunity have not pushed into much. And so I don't know if I have the expertise to be able to answer this question well. I think one of the things that kind of a broader scale that we've talked about is just the importance of going up to Raleigh and trying to encourage better kind of sexual health discussions in the school context. And that's something that we don't have as much freedom to make local decisions about. But again, this is not my area of expertise, so I don't know if I have a great answer for that question, Michael.
Well, a follow-up, I think, to your previous comment is a question about what are some strategies for working with the neighboring towns in particular, where there's concerns about these changing densities affects property values and community dynamics.
Yeah, So I think this is another area where we're just starting to think Leading on Opportunity has historically been focused just on Mecklenburg County, but especially as we think about our advocacy potential to go up to Raleigh and to kind of make asks, it's going to be crucial that we partner with some of our neighboring towns in the counties around us, just because of the dynamics of our state legislature. And so in terms of strategies, I think part of it is thinking more regionally about kind of how we go about doing this work, and thinking about, if we zoom out that opportunity atlas map, we can see that there are, similar economic mobility issues happening in Gaston County, in Cabarrus County, in Rowan County as well. And so how do we, as we start to learn more about what might work in Charlotte, pilot similar things in those communities so people kind of feel a sense of collective focus on this, because it's not just, the way it manifests in Charlotte may be different than the way that it manifests in other places, but we can learn a lot from one another.
Right. I think a kind of a follow-up question is about the strategies for, I think we talk in a variety of contexts about, not just squeezing the balloon, but letting air out of the balloon. How do you do this without creating all these unintended negative consequences?
So how do we do that without creating negative consequences? I'm not familiar with the squeezing the balloon metaphor.
Well, the idea is if you have a problem, you squeeze down on it and your problem is contained, but it just means it appears elsewhere or in a different form.
Yes. Well, so this is why I think displacement is such an important lens to have on this work, because particularly from a data perspective, we don't have access to the type of IRS data that originally ranked us 50 out of 50. And so we have to use census data primarily as the way to measure that. And so if you look at some of those 9 things we enumerated as, potential ways to measure progress, all of those things, a great example of this is if you look at Wilmore on the kind of mobility map with the red and the blue squares, it is kind of like dark yellow. It's moving towards red. But that was because that data represents kids who were born in the 80s. And so if we look at it using kind of some of those metrics from those 9 factors that I discussed, you'll see that it's like all blue. And that's not because Wilmore improved. That's because the people who used to live in Wilmore don't live in Wilmore anymore. And so we have to think really strategically about not only how we react to and kind of get out ahead of displacement, but also how we measure this. And I know the Urban Institute at UNCC is doing some work now where they're partnered with some philanthropic organizations to try to map displacement risk around the city, so we can kind of see in advance where we might be pushing on the balloon and where it might be kind of pushing people out. But again, I think there's a lot of room for collective impact on that.
Okay. Probably the last question for you then is like building on what you said about Salt Lake City and others that have a lot of blue. What else can we learn from what they're doing to get those areas blue that we can adapt?
Yes. So great question. I think that the thing that is kind of a bit deceiving about Salt Lake City is that their city looks very different from ours. So Salt Lake City ranks off the charts in terms of social capital. And that's because something like 70% of Salt Lake City residents are members of the Mormon Church. And that is a really high impact institution that connects people who are otherwise different from one another. And so we can, in some ways, we can learn from that we need more spaces where we can connect for people who are different from us. But in other ways, we kind of have to step back and say, well, Salt Lake City is probably not the best model for us to look at, even though they're number 1. And that kind of holds true for some of the other ones that are at the top of the list. But we can look at other cities that have similar kind of economic outlooks, demographic compositions. That demographic composition is another big difference between us and Salt Lake City. They are overwhelmingly white. And so their economic mobility has not had to grapple with some of the history of kind of racial separation, redlining, and things like that, because they just basically redlined the whole town and said, don't move here if you don't look like us. So again, a bit deceptive that Salt Lake City is doing well. So we can look at places like Minneapolis, places like Nashville, places like DC, who are similar to us in housing market, in different sorts of demographic components, and we can use those as models for kind of how we do this work. And a lot of what we're doing at Leading on Opportunity benchmarks from those cities.
Wonderful, thank you. Do you have any final thoughts as you get ready to leave us this morning?
Well, I am just, again, honored to spend time with you guys this morning and excited to hear what comes out of some of these kind of panel discussions. I really liked the way that it was structured to kind of be working sessions together. I think that's exciting. And you guys have so many folks here who are engaged with this work. Let us know at Leading on Opportunity if there's any way that we can be engaged with projects that y'all are working on. We're always eager to, as Dr. Telfair talked about, the collective impact really comes from us all kind of raising our hand and saying that we're going to do this work together as a community. And I think Charlotte, in a negative way for a long time, was a city run by just a handful of folks, and they made all the decisions for the community. And in some ways, we can leverage that to our benefit now. We're still a small town in some senses, even though we're growing, and we can use that as a way to get everyone who is trying to kind of move the needle on this in a room together and really push this work forward. So I think we have a lot of potential here, and it's exciting to see organizations like AFI having this conversation as well. So thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you again, particularly for framing your presentation around the positive. We tend to focus and define our work in terms of problems and the negative. And so framing it around what works and what we need to do to have it work for everyone was a really nice change of pace for us. So